So welcome everyone. This is Dr. Alana James, and today is the review of it's a wrong screen. I didn't do this. Today is methodology, and I didn't clean up my first screen. So it should say PhD Scholars for Methodology, and it's a cross comparison. So to remind everyone, if in case you're one of the people who hasn't come before, these webinars that are the PhD Scholars argumentation, and then the 5 different major things we talk about, background, lit, methodology, results, and findings, are part of a greater whole that is a system now that unpacks for you easily all of the resources of doctoral net and PD education for dissertation writers. And they can be articles, they can be videos, they can be conversations for those of you that are social learners, and there are also some badges or activities you can do to test that you know what you're doing before you actually have to do it. And all of those things are housed in https://graduatepd.education. So it's a new site, it's a beta site, and it has a lot of things for you that back up these webinars. Also, at any given time, if you have questions, there will be a Wooclap, and today's Wooclap is, predictably, wooclap.com/methodology. We have 5 questions that have come in already, but you might want to make note of that. And if you have questions as we go, it's a good place to put them. They will get answered not only during this webinar, but also I will write out all of the answers for everybody so that you'll have a document that will come in the newsletter probably in April that will have everybody's questions and as a sheet that you can refer to as you go forward. We're also testing an idea. We've known for a long time, I've been trying different things to have virtual groups. And after a conversation last week, we've determined that the next iteration is going to be group coaching and peer support. And there is one of those meetings directly after this meeting. And we had a great response. We had 123 people sign up already, and a full list of Wooclaps. And what will happen is I'll do these once a month. People can write in through Wooclap the questions that they would like me to address. And then after we're done addressing, I'll turn off the recording, and then those of you who have come can offer each other interesting peer conversations and support. I'll bow out of the room at that time. So we think it's a good way for you to get to know each other and also for you to get your questions answered. So again, this webinar is part of a greater whole. Our agenda for today is to talk about what makes the methodology section both easy and hard. And there's some demos of some tools, 3 in particular, that might make some of the confusing bits a little easier. Also, we want to talk about a couple of things you might choose to do. Some people will choose to do, and that's your whether or not you want to put a diagram of either your theory or your background or how your methodology works in your methodology section, and then whether or not and when to include lit on your methodology. Finally, and this is the big portion, that we're going to fly through those first 2 because we're going to really spend some time on a comparative study across different fields of finished dissertations and thesis and what they did for methodology. Some were the standard final thesis, and others were experiments, a number of experiments or a number of articles that were kind of woven together in this final document. So different needs, and how does methodology sections work in those different needs. We have some Wooclap questions and answers, and there may be more that come in. And then what if you only have 15 minutes a day? How are you going to do this? So that's the agenda for today. What makes methodology both easy and hard, and some tools to help. Well, what makes methodology easy is that actually it's a bit formulaic in what you need to write. So your reader needs to know what your questions are and how you're going to answer them. And the how you're going to answer them is then what kind of data you must collect, or you have collected, depending on whether you're a pre-proposal writer or a pre-viva or final defense writer. And how you collected that data, from whom or what. So if you're biology, if you're in biology and you're doing experiments in the lab, your whom is more of a what you did. And if you're doing anything that has to do with human beings, then you have a population and a sample, and you're needing to convince us that asking those people under those conditions will actually help you answer the question for a broader based communication. And then what kind of quantity of results did you need in order to bring in credible answers? So there's something in the quantitative side of things called power. And you can't ask 12 people a question in a survey and have enough power to feel like you got a cross-section of your wider population with those 12. On the other hand, for qualitative, you can ask 12 people if the 12 people are chosen well and to bring in credible results. So those questions need to be teased out so that your reader understands how you made your choices and they can agree or disagree with your choices. And then how you found those data, how you protected your resources, that's the ethics portion of this, and how your analysis either will work if you're pre-proposal or did work if you're post-proposal. Now, I say it's formulaic because you can go out and find a final dissertation or 2 or 3 that used your methodology, and you can see different forms of how they did it, and you can guide your ship, and you can even be talking about the same things they talked about in those different sections, because if you're doing phenomenology in one setting, phenomenology in another setting will have many of the same concerns that need to be answered. So models work very well for you here. And the handouts, I'm being told, are for the Lit Review chapter. There is a link at the top of this that is the comparative methodology chapter. And bear with me a moment. I will just go make sure. Let me just add the right handouts. Hopefully it's fast enough. Thank you, Adrian, for pointing out. This should be 0206 for methodology, comparative methodology final. So looks like it's the right spreadsheet. Hopefully it's different. Okay, so you will need that spreadsheet open in a minute. So next, what makes it difficult is that your reader is at different points in what they need to see from you. So if you're a pre-proposal writer and you're working on your methodology, your committee, at least as I examine pre-proposal documents, what I want to see is that the writer really understands the nuts and bolts of what they will be doing. A common error pre-proposal is that the person is mimicking somebody else's words about what happens, but when you question them, they can't answer you back like they really have any understanding of what that's going to be like. So my recommendation there is that before you go to a proposal hearing, you have had conversation with people who have actually done the work you are telling your committee you are going to do. And you have questioned them about what worked and what didn't work and how, literally, what the work was like. And that's what I would, as a committee member, want you to be able to tell me. Because otherwise, I'm afraid that if I pass your proposal, I'm sending you out to be frustrated because you didn't really know what it was you were going to do, what it was going to be like. And people who've really done it will tell you that there's a lot more to getting the data than you think there's going to be when you're in proposal, in most cases. So it's good that you have an understanding of those things and that you've really taken the time to figure it out. Now, pre-defense, or Viva, if you're in Europe, or the Global South, then your final defense committee will want to know the specifics of what happened. You might include a timetable of how it really went, and you also might consider having conversation about what went wrong, because almost no methodology proceeds like clockwork, like it's going to be rolled out. So it's useful when you're in the final to be having a conversation with another researcher, and researchers talk as much about what went wrong as what went right. So methodology is difficult in that your reader needs to understand the problem and how your methods will address that problem. That's who you're speaking to. Your reader wants to use this section, which is known as the heart of your dissertation or thesis. It's where everything leads into the methodology before it, and everything leads out of the methodology to your results after it. So your reader needs to understand the heart of what you're doing, and that's the problem and how your methods will answer that problem. You also need to engage your reader, because these things can be deadly dull to read, if the reader is just, or the writer is just kind of blandly telling us what they think they're going to do. So you want to write in a way that's engaging. Also, your methodology, your committee is likely to tear this apart. It's one of the things that other researchers do to each other is with each other is to say, really, are these the methods that are going to best answer this set of questions? So if you're pre-proposal, be prepared to have a discussion about the methods you chose not to use and why you chose not to use them. So in the middle of a proposal defense, you might commonly would have a committee member say, well, why is this phenomenology? Why isn't this X, Y, and Z? And you'll need to be able to say, I thought about that, and this is what happened. All right, so those are the things that make it easy, and those are the things that make it hard. Now, we have some tools that may help depending on where you are, and I want to make sure that you know about them. If you go into any of the university initials.pd.education or temu.doctoralnet.com site, and you sign in, on the right-hand side is your to-do list, as shown on the left-hand side of the slide. And when you click on that link about self-assessing, there are 3 self-assessments that are very good as you're considering whether or not your methodology answers all the criteria. Assuming you've already figured out that your topic and your research problem and your problem statement work. I didn't highlight those, but because that's kind of an earlier stage, the what am I doing stage. But when you're in the methodology stage, you're going to want to come back to these self-assessments and check out research questions, population, and sample. So I thought I'd show you what they look like if you were to click into them. If you click into research question, there's some yes or no questions, and then there's some steps where you can hit many points. So it's an easy survey questionnaire to see kind of what do you know what you're doing, and then what are your research questions. When you've gone through that process, which is really am I able to think broadly about my research questions, and what would I say if other people asked me this question, then what's on the right-hand side are the criteria which your committee will be looking at your research questions to see if they address those criteria. And this allows you to say yes, no, according to your particular study. And then at the end of this, you'll be given a PDF. And if you're still in the getting it together stage, or you have any questions, you can take that PDF to your supervisor or advisor or committee chair, whatever your university calls that person, and you can have a conversation and they can see how you ranked yourself on these things. And they can agree or disagree with that ranking. But it allows you to have a pretty interesting, informative conversation. So we hope that that's a helpful self-assessment tool. Now, the one for self-assessing your population, much shorter, 3 questions, to look at your research question, the population, and can you identify the population of your study? And hopefully you'll be able to easily think yes, but you want to go deeper, and you also want to say, well, how do I know yes? If I'm asked a question about this, what do I say? Because that's what you're going to be writing as you talk about your population. And then finally, and I think this can be very helpful if you're worried, if the population and sample out of that population, samples a little bit more complex a decision. And this particular self-assessment gives you some choices that you can think about, and again, some points you can follow logically, and then at the end, gives you a PDF, and you can have conversations with other people about it. So hopefully, those are very useful tools for some of you. And if you're pre-proposal, they'll be useful because it'll help you understand the criteria you need to write to. If you're finishing up, it's not harmful to go back to these tools just to kind of make your head still on straight for all the little things that need to be totally in alignment in order to easily pass at the end. Okay, now a few more general notes that will lead us into this conversation about the comparative study of the dissertations and thesis we're looking at today for their methodology. First off, this idea of diagramming. Again, we need to look at what your reader needs. So, does your theoretical or conceptual base for your research contain several parts? If so, consider figuring out a diagram of how those parts go together and end up in your methodology with your questions. That can save a lot of problems. Those are difficult junctures to write, and so you might not want to lead it just on your writing. You might want to give your reader a picture, and then they can tell you that there might be better ways to write it, but they'll at least understand how you see these ideas coalescing into your methodology. Does the logic of your study run into an either-or circumstance? And this will be one of the examples in our comparative study today, where they had data, and then if the data was this, they went this way, and if the data was that, they went this other way. And that is a difficult set of junctures to write out in a way, just in words. Really easy to do in a diagram, however. So consider, when is a picture worth 1,000 words? And then use them. Perfectly appropriate in methodology to do that. And then finally, does your reader really need to understand your methodological reasoning? And I'm going to use action research, which is my methodology, as an example. When I'm writing action research, I don't want to talk a lot about action research, but I do need my readers to understand that what I'm going through is iterative. So, and that I'm looking to build something good for the future. That's the purpose of doing action research. So I'm going to include a couple of paragraphs about action research and why it's chosen and how I use it before I kick them off into what the data show, so that they can understand that the conclusions and findings that I'm coming to have been built over lots of consecutive smaller steps, rather than one long, here's the data, this is what it means. It's a different kind of logic, and I need my reader to understand how my logic is built. So, under those considerations, you might consider putting in those pieces. So today's conversation is a comparative study. That is the link I'm just making sure that mine is open. And bear with me, it has to come up. So we have been looking at these same dissertations for a couple of weeks. And I was very curious as I went into them, how these people that we've kind of become to know what they're studying, we're going to engage their reader. What was the problem? Were we going to agree or disagree with their methodological choices? And then how were they going to engage the reader through their writing? So those are the questions I'm answering. And if you pull open the spreadsheet, it's really columns E, F, and G, or yeah, E, G, and H. I buried column F. E, G, and H that we're looking at. All right, so everybody have it open, I hope, who's in the room. And if you're watching by recording, stop the video for a minute, go to that link. Make sure you have it open because the slides won't change, but our conversation will for the next little bit of time. All right, looking at the first column. The first column is a phenomenological study of, it's a business study, and it's looking at intangible assets in business and how they play on the valuation of a business as is needed for other people to invest in the business. So you would think that the whole purpose of this study is that so many people think that the value of a company is its bottom line. But in fact, in a manufacturing firm, it's all those little intangibles that add up to whether or not this company is totally going to thrive. And so how do people value that, and how do they figure it out? And this person chose to do a phenomenological study because they wanted to understand the experiences of buyers of small manufacturing businesses and how they had valued the business because of the intangible assets. So it's people talking to people kind of a study. Now, how are they going to engage the reader in this? How are they going to convince us that they can solve the problem? And this is a pretty standard 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 chapter dissertation or thesis. They're using a model that is well used. Their headings are what we would expect to see. If you look at column H, research design, why it's appropriate, the questions, the population, the consent, all of the things, confidentiality, very small variation, instrumentation, collection, analysis, validity. All those are headings that we would expect to see in most methodological chapters. The one that's a little odd is the one I've highlighted, geographic location. And so it pinpoints the fact that these people were in a part of the world, and that might or might not be the same for other parts of the world, and because of so much of the economy is based on geographic location. But this is what I would consider a pretty normal first chapter, so I'll just read it. The purpose of this chapter is to provide an outline and explanation of the research methodology used, including research design, population, sample selection technique, research instrument, data collection, and analysis. That first sentence could be written by anybody in any dissertation. This researcher has identified and explained in detail the components of the research, including key specific questions, This study explored how intangible assets are recognized in the small manufacturing business valuation process from the perspective of the active buyer. The results of this research will add value in this way. The impact of this research is. Now remember, your argument, so I'm going to take us back to the first one of these. Your argument all the way through is that your work is significant because. So how do we rate this? I would rate this as a pretty boring first paragraph. And I would hope you would spend a little bit more time thinking about your reader and say, what do they really need? This sentence, to me, that's the most important sentence backing up the claim of the study is the results of this research will add value to the current body because this study explored how intangible assets are recognized. So by simply rearranging this pretty normal, pretty boring paragraph, the writer could have chosen to engage the reader into the problem and then had a conversation with them about how the things in this chapter would help them understand how that problem would be solved. Now, as I said at the beginning, all of these are finished dissertations. They pass committee. This will always pass committee. You will see many, many dissertations that will have a paragraph very similar to this one in the beginning of their methodology chapter. So there is nothing wrong with it. And if you have a particularly conservative committee, you might choose to go to something like this because it's easier to play into conservative with something that is seen often. But to the extent that you want to be the most engaging writer you can be, I would say, think about rearranging what you do from your reader's point of view. Let's go into the second one. Again, a pretty standard 5-chapter dissertation or thesis. This one's a little bit more convoluted, actually. This author is investigating what current educational leaders in higher education who have performing arts backgrounds think of or have experienced in their leadership the performing arts part of their background. So it's tying a circumstance of current job to a circumstance of prior educational history and asking them, how do these go together? And what does it mean in terms of leadership? This person engages their reader through talking right away about the importance of their study and the difficulties of their study, and then leading us into, again, in about the middle, highlighted in yellow, the goal of this study was to discover the meaning that educational leaders with performing arts backgrounds ascribe to their education and experiences as performing artists, to understand how these leaders make sense of that duality in their background. And so there we have it. And I think well done in this case. This author chooses to put the research questions right there. So we can see everything is going to lead, all the data collected are going to lead to those research questions. And we can read through how those data will be collected with a mind to, will those data actually answer those questions? What I thought was interesting in the way they laid out their chapter in terms of headings was a conversation about the 4 phases of coding. Now, remember I talked about the fact that if you're pre-proposal, your committee wants to see that you know what you're going to do. This is a post-proposal. This is a final piece. And they laid out specifically the 4 phases of their coding. Very important conversation if you're doing qualitative work. How did you get to your themes? How did you code this? Did you have an inter-rater reliable coder with you? How did that work? The specifics of that process are very important in the data analysis, and this important enough that I agree with this author that it should be considered a heading until its own right. Okay, if we go down to the next one, this is the last of the final of the 5-chapter pretty normal setups, and this is the one that uses, and I've included it for you here, a diagram. So this particular dissertation or thesis looks at ways to measure errors in medical devices. And it's actually a series of, as it's often true in engineering, a model is proposed and then a model is developed and tested. So that's the process. And a lot of it was done iteratively. And that's why they needed the diagram, because they went through the basic phase of setting it up. In the diagram, those are the gray boxes. And then once they have a model, it can go one way or another. So if it goes one way, it shoots off to the left in the red in the generation and evaluation. And if it goes another way, it goes down. Both of those coalesce towards the end. And so it shows us this would be so much easier to do in a diagram than it ever could do if they were just trying to write it out for me to understand. So I think it's a very good use of that. I also want to point out here the parts in yellow and the parts in blue, that this was it was an iterative model. They had to develop a model, and then they had to validate that model, and then they were prescribing two different advantages to the model, which helped it go one of two directions in the final analysis. So all of that, a bit unusual and a very well put together. So as a completely novice person on the outside, I can follow the logic, and then I can look at the diagram. It will make sense to me, even if it's a new approach that I'm unfamiliar with. I'll be able to get through the methodology section and know exactly where the results and findings are going to take me. All right, then we get into some more complex problems that some of you may be facing. So the one that is on line 5 is a soil science piece, and it's two different studies. Actually, it's putting together. Some of you may have done research. You may have actually had this research published in Nature or one of the scientific things, and then or magazines or journals. Then at the end, you have to put those together in a document that your committee signs off on. So in this case, there were two studies, and the methods are then, where do you put them? You don't have the nice 5 chapters and you put it all in one place. And this author chose to do that, as we've discussed in the literature and the background section, by heading one first study, taking us all the way through it, and then giving us the second study, taking us all the way through it, and then helping us as readers think through the comparison between those and what the final meaning is with the broader experimental process that went on during this doctoral work. So the first study, I think what I liked about this is how directly straightforward it was. A controlled greenhouse study was implemented. It was to study these properties. It was over this period of time. The greenhouse study used what kind of a randomization in the humanities world, that would be what your population and samples were, and how those designs were divided, 4 substrata types, 2 experiments, etc., and then into the specific things that were measured, and then into what they were looking for specifically in terms of the outcome. Because the question here is, how do you build topsoil again when it's been damaged due to extreme conditions, and to reach a desired level of strength so that it will maintain itself in the marshlands over time? So clear scientific writing, step by step, following a pattern of all the things that need to be done in methodology in one paragraph, and straightforward. So I think that's what I want people to take, is that well done, well crafted methodology can be very straightforward. The next one down is a study about, it's a business study again, although it's interesting because it's a business management degree, but it's an experimental study using college students as the study sample. So that's interesting to me. I'm not sure whether, if I was on the proposal committee, I might have wanted a slightly different sample to also be tested. But what they did was 3 experiments, scenario experiments. So bring in a bunch of college students, pay them $10 each, get them to sit down and ask what they would do in certain scenarios. Find out what they would do, compare the results, and make some decisions about the behavior of people and whether or not people are more likely to punish deception or reward honesty. And the scenarios had some availability to be massaged as they went through the process. So leaving aside whether or not you can ask college students about things that go on in business and have it be a valid test, what I thought was interesting was the way that this author put their piece together, because again, it was 3 different experiments, and so they chose to give us an overview section, an introductory chapter that takes us actually through everything, including how the experiments were run. So the methodology is in chapter 1, and that's basically all it is. And then they take us through the experiments, each one, and then they conclude at the end. Again, a useful model for those of you that now at the end have lots of really good pieces, but you need to know how to put them together in one cogent whole, which can be published as your thesis. And then finally, a very interesting study that really has to do with how people think over a lifetime and develop their ideas. And it uses Charles Darwin as the main conversation. So a lot of archival evidence was probed about Charles Darwin because he kept good notes, he had good journals. We have a lot of things available. They've been studied over time, so there was a lot of material available. And this author is actually proposing a theory of foraging, that when we think we know something and we're developing ideas, we then go out into a broader realm and forage new aspects of what we're doing. And then we bring it into our expertise, and that helps our expertise grow. And I'm struck by this theoretically because I think it matches my experience of life. But it's a difficult, very difficult. First off, there's many kinds of archival evidence they had to look at. They looked at it from many different viewpoints. That's messy. They're trying to get to something without, they have a strong bias that this might be true. So that's a difficulty in their methodology. So they have to look at it from many points of view and really query strongly whether or not what they saw happening longitudinally over time actually backs up what their theoretical base is or not. They have to come up with the evidence that doesn't agree. A very complex study, worthy of looking at from just how this author handled the complexities. But so what is the problem here? The problem is to track and model how adults build expertise over a lifetime through mixing different experiential and contextual learning options. Okay, so that's interesting. And then how are we going to be engaged in that? This person, and I think this is a really worthwhile thing for you to consider doing if and to the extent your study tells a good human story. This study consistently ties complexity together through being able to engage us with storytelling. So it starts, the past chapter examined Darwin's reading notebooks and how he organized the cultural milieu through different phases of exploration and exploitation through information, theoretical measures, etc. We examined the fruit of that foraging expedition, bringing in their language. The origin of the species was the fruit, and how its development observed in the writing of intermediate drafts is related. And the question, though, is that with Darwin, there was this period of time, he finished The Origin of the Species, but he didn't publish it for a very long time. And that has been a topic of many Darwin people. So this person looks at that from a different points of view and is actually using the methodology to help us understand the points that we're going to get to. In terms of information foraging theory, the previous chapter assumed that no goal-directed behavior. Yet our measure of relative surprise, we were able to automatically extract epoch breaks that coincided with biographical changes in goals. So by overlaying timeline of his life on to the things they saw, they were able to forage out another possibility. To the extent that your writing is dealing with something that's complex, if it's a humanistic point of view, if you can tell us a story, you will keep us as readers engaged, where if we were just to talk about this from a theoretical point of view, people would go to sleep. So interesting. All right, those were the thoughts that were provoked in me when I thought just about how these authors wrote methodology and what the easy and hard things were that they were looking at. And once again, I'm saying this from a position of, yes, there is a formula to writing your methodology, but it is much more than that when it's the heart of what you're doing, and you want your reader to stay engaged with you so that they're really ready at the end of this chapter to see what your results showed. Okay, that's it for me. Now let's go to people in the room. If there is, thank you for those of you who were pointing out that Adrian listed an APA 7th manual has documents called JARs, which outline in detail what's to be included in each section. Also, some of the universities will have rubrics that will outline what's to be involved in each section. As a student or having helped students through those, sometimes they are dense, and you're not, if you don't just go, okay, I need this, here's my sentence for that. Okay, I need this, here's my sentence for that. Put those things in and then re-superimpose your reader's point of view, as we've seen some of these people do, to help them flow from one thing to others of those. So thank you, Adrian. Very good extra piece put in. And then Gary, thanks for putting up where the comparative study that I was reading from. Okay, now where are we? We're an overview of what can happen in this methodology section. And again, depending on where you are when you come to this video and you're listening, you can go to graduate.pd.education. You can sign in with your university sign-in sheet, and your password is, I'll type it in here, capital D OCS hashtag 123. Ooh, I wrote @ but I meant hashtag. Docs hashtag 123. And you should be able to get in. If you can't get in, then that just means you haven't been signed up yet, and you need to write Sonia at pd.education, and she will let you in, because anybody who is attending or watching any of these webinars will be given access to those modules. So each webinar has a module behind it, and I'm doing a comparative study that overviews some finished documents. But if you're still on the how do I put this together phase of this, You may want more backup than that. And you're given in each section articles, videos, a conversation, and some tests that you can do to help you on your way, depending on where you're needed. Okay, let's look and see what's happened in Wooclap. And pulling up my screen, let's see, there are some different questions. So I'll read off of the ones that are current. Someone questioned that it's hard to know about the level of detail required in a methodology section. I would err to the too much specificity side, especially as a finishing up person. When you're going into Viva, I think you can say what it was like, and in the sections. So let's look at any methodology. You design your methodology, you get it together. That's going to be pretty much the same pre-proposal, post-proposal. It's how it was designed. Here's the diagram. Here's what I thought was going to happen. Then a conversation about what actually happened. Because you can think you're going to have a sample of 250 and you can get significantly less than that, and therefore you then have to go back 2 or 3 or 4 times to get enough power to make your study work. So that specificity needs to be there. I need to know how hard it was. I need to know what the challenges were, so that I can judge if there are any wobbles in the way your figures were put together or wobbles in the way your story is being told. Some of those wobbles may come from difficulty in actually getting the design to roll out. But then, especially in quantitative studies, but also in qualitative study, I want some definitive numbers. I want to know how many actually occurred, how many had to be thrown out because they didn't finish all the parts, how many didn't meet certain requirements. So out of the general population, you just slid those off to the side and they're not included. I also may want you to just kind of do a small evaluation of those to see if they had if they went along with the whole. For instance, in a study of someone I'm working with right now, they have a pretty large population. Some of the people were new, didn't do this or that, and they're just being set aside. They're not going to be analyzed. But as an examiner, I would probably ask that person, did you look at those people? Are they about in the same place? Is there anything in their data, because they were different, that might be different than their final solutions and findings? Do you see what I'm saying? There may be some comparative points there. Easy enough to say, yes, I did it. No, there was no particular difference. No, it wouldn't work to do it because whatever. But be aware that those kind of details are what your committee is going to look for. What actually happened, if there's any discrepancy between what happened and what thought to happen, why that was, and how it probably affected your data, and then what you take from all of that. They also might ask you, if you were to do it over, what would you do differently? So you don't write that, but you should be prepared for that. So level of detail. Now, another thing I want to say about that is that I strongly recommend throughout your research process, once you start to collect data, you keep a journal and you make notes about the specific things that are happening. That makes writing that level of detail much easier. And then at the end, they can take it out. They can tell you it's not important. They can whatever, or you can, but you have it there. And better in this case to have more that that you can refer back to when they ask you a question than less, and you have to fill in spaces that you didn't actually write, because that often ends up with them making you write it later. Okay, second question. How does this chapter change after you've finished data collection and analysis? That's a really good question. So those of you who had to write a proposal and had to write your methodology, chapter in a final proposal, you wrote all of that chapter in a what will happen point of view. And that will change significantly into a past tense, here's what happened point of view, and much more specificity will get addressed. So that's the big change. What are the common weaknesses for this chapter? That things don't agree well. And that this chapter doesn't agree well with other things. So for instance, if you in your literature review chapter really drilled into the fact that there were weaknesses in the overall literature in a couple of places, you call them gaps or whatever, then I'm going to look right away to see, are your questions questioning about those gaps, and does this methodology give you data that will in fact fill those gaps? And sometimes I've seen students imagine it would work, and it's more like, well, these are the data I can get, and I hope they fill those gaps. But the logic between those data and those gaps was less than completely clear. So that's a turn it back in and get something else a little bit stronger before you pass kind of problem. Other things can be that in a final thing that somebody just didn't rewrite this chapter enough, and that a lot of future tenses still hang out there. Be aware that when you write at the end, you have to move your future tense to past tense. You have to speak from a different voice. And so you want to catch all those and not assume that because it passed the first time, it doesn't need much work. Other than that, by the time you finished it, you went through a proposal and you were given go ahead to do this methodology to answer those questions. So you may find at the end that your methodology isn't everything it was meant to be, that you would have done things differently, and that's just a result. That's not a weakness in the chapter. Sometimes it doesn't all work out at the end, and that's a fine result. You just have to write it that way. And how not to be redundant with chapter 1. Good question also. So in chapter 1, especially for those of you that are writing to a rubric or a really defined, here's all the things, and chapter 1 is supposed to include your problem statement and a little bit of background on your lit in your problem statement and what your research questions are and an outline of the nature of your study and those kind of things. It may feel like you've written all this before by the time you get to 3. And I would say 1 should be a sentence or 2 for every paragraph or 2 in 3. So 3 should tease out more specificity and more theoretical base. It should be thought-provoking in terms of this is why you're doing it this way. It should have that kind of a basis to it. Whereas 1 is, this is what I'm studying and here's how it works. 3 is, and let's really dig into whether or not this research done this way will get us where we need to go. And finally, getting the right information. And I think the easiest way to do that is to have lots of models and to query their methodology chapters like I did today in this one, to query them about how they set up their chapter, what they included, how they engaged their reader, how they laid it out, 1, 2, 3, 4, whether they included geographical or some of the things that are really specific. Those are the right information pieces. So to refer back to that spreadsheet, the person who was put in the 4 phases of coding, that's the right information for a qualitative study at the end. Geographic location is the right information if that's an important part of how you chose your sample. How the models were developed and then validated and what advantages those gave you and how you worked with that is the right information. And the the diagram would be the right way to give that information. So good question, but very specific to what your study is. If you can pin down what is the right information for your audience, then your audience will be well pleased with what you give them. Okay. So those are my questions. Those are the questions that came in today. Now, maybe the people in the room have other questions. Raise your hand if you do, and I'll watch for them. But while you're writing them out, if you do, I just want to give you a what do you do, how do you do this if you only have a few minutes a day to get it done. So I tried to parcel out into a 15 minutes a day how you were going to go forward. And I think these sections always start with you analyzing different finished dissertations that are similar to yours, like we did in our comparative study. There is no better way for you to figure out what you need to be doing than to look at some other people's finished products. Good writers are good readers. In our case, as academics, critical readers. And then you want to do any of the tools that you need to do from your universitypd.education site, as I mentioned in the first part of this. And you know how to get there. You need to plot your headings and your topic areas. Now, as you fill in those headings, I would suggest you should ask yourself what you don't know. And this is if you're in a pre-proposal state. So if you're pre-proposal and you don't know, you're writing, I'm going to do a thematic analysis of da-da-da, but you don't really know what a thematic analysis amounts to, and you can't actually picture the work. Then I want you to go talk to people who have done it and ask very specific questions about how does this work? How do you do it? What software did you use? Was that hard or not? Get some real stories out of those questions so that you're prepared for them, not only in your writing, but in your committee work. And then if you're done with data, you need to record everything that happened. And so be prepared to put in all the specifics. And then if it's too much specifics, you can make them bullet points. You can squeeze them together. You can make them concise. But really, it's easier to make something concise once it's all there than it is to keep adding it bits and pieces. Write a section a day, get them all done, and then revise them. Because revision, when you've got the whole thing ahead of you, is different than revision when you're doing it, what you just wrote yesterday. And always, always, always say this, can't say this too much, keep your reader's perspective in mind. So, no hands have gone up. So I'm thinking the people in the room are well satisfied and don't have questions. You can go to the Wooclap up until the end of February and keep asking questions, because in March, I will go through all the Wooclaps from this entire series and make a document that answers these questions. So if we realize that people who are coming to this entire series may be at all different parts of getting their work done. All the different resources will continue to be there for you, and I will answer all Wooclaps a little while later. And then finally today, there is a survey, https://www.surveymonkey.com/r/web experience. Please go there and tell us whether this webinar met your needs as a graduate student to help your work get easier. We are guiding our ship through your telling us the best things and the things that do and don't work. As educators, we often have ideas that we're doing wonderful things only to find out they weren't as wonderful as we thought, or vice versa. So please give us 2 seconds of your time for those 3 questions, and we appreciate it very much. And with that, today, I'm going to end our webinar because right now, you can flip over to the graduate group, coaching group, and we have lots of questions that have come in from Wooclap that I will be answering. So I will end this webinar and meet some of you in the other webinar space in just a moment.